Thank you, Dr. Coburn. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Mr. True, you might be the best person to answer this question. How do you determine whether an account is compliant?
Senator, today we have put all the FATCA requirements in place. So we're really looking at whether someone is a U.S. person from a tax perspective, U.S. nationality, green card, substantial presence test. We have them sign all these documents. We're also looking at dual citizens because often you have in Europe people who might have been born in the U.S. and they're dual citizens now. So really looking at all of these people, and now they're signing waivers. They're all signing also a W-9 at this point. And once FATCA is in place, we can then transmit the account information to the IRS under the intergovernmental agreement that Switzerland has entered into with the United States.
Okay, so you determine compliance because they basically sign waivers and a W-9, which gets reported back to the IRS, and so everybody knows that they've got an account there, and then that income is reported to the IRS, just like it is in any other normal bank.
Exactly. It will be now starting July 1st with FATCA, and someone would be a fool to sign all of that and not pay the taxes.
I want to understand a little bit about what is so different about the 230 accounts where we actually receive the names versus the other 22,000. I mean, what is unique that those 230 names were actually supplied?
Historically, Switzerland made a difference between what the Swiss defined as tax fraud and tax evasion. And under the double tax treaties in the past, you would only be able to get administrative assistance in tax matter if the tax fraud standard was really fulfilled. And the Swiss courts have determined that these 238 accounts have the tax fraud standard fulfilled. The other accounts, and by far not all of the 22,000 are not tax compliant, as I tried to explain before, but let's assume there are a number of those who are not tax compliant that would qualify as tax evasion. They would be covered by the new treaty because Switzerland agreed to the new OECD standards, dropped this tax fraud requirement, accepted the tax evasion requirement, accepted also in 2012, as was mentioned by Chairman Levin, the group requests. And so once this treaty is signed, the IRS could just sort of send out these requests and these accounts should come in.
So the 238 accounts were determined fraudulent.
Yes.
They were committing fraud.
Yes.
How was that determined? How did the Swiss authorities determine that those 238 out of the 22,000 were actually engaged in some kind of tax fraudulent activity?
Yeah, Senator, it's a very good question. We have several court decisions by the Swiss Federal Administrative Court that have set the standards for fraud. Typically, these were entity accounts, like someone had an offshore entity, a U.S. person was sort of hiding behind an offshore entity. The corporate governance of the entity was violated. They held U.S. securities. I think these are the three main criteria to qualify for the fraud standard.
How are those entities targeted? I mean, how were they ever investigated? I mean, we obviously didn't know their name, so obviously Swiss authority has opened up some kind of investigation for those 238 accounts?
Yes, Senator, there was a group request by the IRS. It went to the Swiss Financial Tax Administration. They forwarded it then to us at Credit Suisse. We had to identify all these accounts that qualified pursuant to these different criteria. We sent them in to the Swiss Federal Tax Administration. It was a somewhat larger group than 238. They then decided which one in their views would qualify. They were then forwarded on to the IRS by the Swiss Federal Tax Administration. Some appealed this decision, and those cases were then decided by the Swiss Federal Administrative Court.
Okay. I think, Mr. Meister, I think you mentioned that some clients and some Swiss bankers were involved in some of these fraudulent transactions. I think that was basically your testimony. I would just kind of like to review in general how important the Swiss banking sector is to Switzerland's economy. The numbers I have is the Swiss economy is somewhere between $600 and $700 billion. Is that correct? Anybody know? Those figures I have.
Maybe
Yeah, it sounds right. I don't think we
And the
couldn't contradict it.
yeah.
I'm seeing the banking sector somewhere between 6 and 12% of that, so somewhere in the
That's-
40 to 75 billion dollar range.
Sounds about right.
That's
Now, when they reported that GDP, is that the profitability of the Swiss banking sector? Obviously, total assets under management are much higher than that.
So yeah, that would be, I would think that would be profitability, yes.
Why would, let's say, a U.S. investor invest into a Swiss bank? What are their motivations?
to invest as an investor. You ask me as an investor. I think one of the points is no doubt that we can, because of the talent and what we can provide as service, bring attractive returns.
Have you historically had far higher returns than, let's say, U.S. banks or British banks or other banks?
I would say largely in line, probably
Largely in line.
I mean, different in different years, obviously, but yeah, I would say not systematically different.
So if U.S. investors have invested, about $12 billion into Swiss banks, I mean, obviously that's a pretty small portion of the Swiss banking assets held, right? Isn't Credit Suisse about $1 trillion in assets held?
Yes, that's right. It is a very small portion, that's correct.
So you have a lot of investors from all over the world then?
Absolutely, yes.
And they invest in Switzerland, again, because? If there's no exceptional returns in Swiss banking, why do they do it into Switzerland?
Well, I'm sorry, I misunderstood your comments before to talking about sort of our equity or our equity as an investment. If you're talking about our asset base, which as you say is over, $1 trillion Swiss francs in terms of assets under management for our clients, I think it's as Mr. Meister said, it is a combination of our ability to provide good service, our ability to provide very competitive returns on those assets as a banking client, our ability to provide lending to those clients, and I think particularly obviously a comprehensive business that we can offer across asset management, private banking, but also some of the wholesale investment banking type services.
Perhaps if I can add also stability of the country and of course also diversification when you have to currency, because Swiss franc as a currency is also a very stable part.
I'm just trying to get to the obvious point of why people put money into Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think.
What's the obvious reason people take their money, transfer it from the United States or from Brazil or from England or from Russia and put their money into Switzerland?
Well, I think
I just want let's state the obvious.
Yes. Well, I think first of all, we actually, we have a global business. So obviously, that $1 trillion of assets is not all in Switzerland.
Okay.
So we have a lot of those assets are here in the U.S. in a standard.
I'm not even targeting Credit Suisse. I'm talking about the Switzerland banking sector. Mm-hmm. Why do people put money? Take money out of their countries of origin and invest in
Switzerland. You mean actually in Switzerland as a country?
Right.
Well, I think historically, as we discussed, I think there has been, one of the things that's obviously highlighted is that there is an ability to, shelter assets and income from paying taxes. Obviously, that is decreasingly the case, and clearly, going forward, our view is that that's not the future of the industry. That's certainly not our business model. We don't think that should be any Swiss bank's business model. And clearly, with FATCA, with a number of the OECD arrangements that are taking place, and also with a number of other developments, that's not an advantage that the Swiss banking system is going to have going forward. So it really has to be around the ability to offer services and returns that are competitive and, in fact, superior to what they can see in other markets and other places where they can put their money.
Okay. Well, again, I appreciate that, I think, forthright answer, because I think it's important to get that basic, obvious reality on the table as we're talking about this, because that's what all the secrecy is about. Right. That's what this whole thing's about. So I think from the U.S. perspective, we're just trying to make sure that Switzerland opens it up, makes it transparent so that U.S. taxpayers can't shelter income over there. If we want to invest in Switzerland because of great returns, we should have the right to do that, but we shouldn't have the right to shelter income. Understood,
and we completely agree with that. We're completely exactly in the same place on that.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Well, you may be in the sense.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dugan, let's kind of go back to my line of questioning, because, again, I just want to get the obvious on the table here. Historically, let's go back. People around the world have deposited money into Swiss banks as a real safe haven.
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Yes.
Is there validity to that? I mean, do you think globally people ought to have some place, whether they're in an incredibly oppressive regime somewhere around the world, it'd be kind of nice to move some money out of that terrible country and put in some safe haven?
Well, I think what we see in terms of our customers around the world is that they do have interest in even being completely tax compliant and no issues around that. They do have an interest in diversifying the jurisdictions where they hold their money. We do see that as an interest from those clients. And
the conundrum right now for the Swiss government is you have, obviously the United States government highly concerned about not being able to collect taxes because people are committing tax fraud and sheltering income there. And now they're having to open up information which puts at risk the ability of the Swiss government to track those types of deposits, correct?
Well, I actually think, our view is actually that that us as an institution in the country has to go to a compliant framework. There's no other choice. So there isn't any other choice. And frankly, I think that the Swiss financial system can be very competitive on that basis. So I do not think that it is necessary, as you say, to have the ability to not pay taxes on money in Swiss banks for the Swiss financial system to be successful. I actually think we'd be a lot better off as a financial system with a completely compliant and transparent framework, which is what we've been promoting, actually.
I agree, and that makes an awful lot of sense. Yeah. So I guess that gets back to the question. Credit Suisse has actually, you have tried to work with and encourage the Swiss government
Absolutely.
To open up and be transparent, because it's in your best interest as a global banking company, because there's still going to be value to have Switzerland as a pretty stable, neutral country, as a safe haven, as a diversification destination for global assets.
We think that's exactly right. We think it's in the best interest of the Swiss financial system. We think it's in our best interest, and we have absolutely promoted that at every level, publicly, with the regulators, with the government as well, because we think that is the right direction for the business and the right direction for Switzerland.
Okay. I would like, because I may be going to the Foreign Relations hearing on treaties later on, so Mr. Cerruti, how could we strengthen that treaty so we don't have the loopholes that Senator Levin's talking about? And again, in the interest of transparency, so that the Swiss banking sector can still operate and provide that safe haven where it's required.
Senator, thank you for your question. I think this is a pretty good treaty. It goes very far because it's going to be really based on the OECD standard of tax evasion. It allows for group requests. It's untested yet. I think what Chairman Levin is afraid of is that the IRS will have to prove the misbehavior of the bank or the participation of the bank. Given that the DOJ has issued that program, as you know, the program for the Swiss banks, and that over 100, I think 106 banks have now filed to be in Category 2, I would assume at this point that all the Category 2 banks, that the misbehavior that's requested under the treaty would be established just by being a Category 2 bank. So I would hope that this treaty would really generate thousands and thousands of account names. That's my hope.
Yeah, and Senator, I guess what we would say is we understand the Chairman's concerns about it, and I'm sure there would be ways to even make that treaty more stronger and even better. This has been approved for 4 years, and our view is that a good first step would be to simply get it approved in the Senate so that we could provide, and in our view, we could provide the vast bulk of the information that's been requested, which we want to do. I mean, we want to provide that information. Just with that treaty approval, we think that would give us would allow us to satisfy the bulk of that request from the U.S. authorities. So I'm sure there are ways to improve it down the line. I mean, we've been working very hard just to get the treaty approved, which is in our view would be the first step and would be a very important step in getting these issues to a great degree resolved and allowing us to provide the information that we'd like to provide.
When I asked a question earlier about how were you able to determine compliance, you talked about clients were signing waivers, they were filling out W-9s for, what prevents you from having every client sign those waivers?
Today, Senator, every U.S. client has to sign these waivers. Everyone who wants to keep an account or open an account at Credit Suisse has to sign these waivers.
And perhaps you could explain the concept of the waiver as to?
There's, on the one hand, there is the W-9 that reports the dividend and interest on U.S. securities. On the other hand, there is the waiver so that we can file the information under the FATCA law starting as of July 1st.
So then what complicates that? Now we start talking about shell corporations and I mean,
FATCA, I think FATCA is a brand new law that has been now implemented and will start taking effect. I was surprised when I read the report last night, just to see that the subcommittee is afraid that FATCA contains loopholes. But I would say let's see how FATCA starts. It's a huge administrative project. We have spent in the first, up to now, we've already spent about $100 million to implement FATCA globally, because it's not just for Switzerland, it's not just for the private bank. We have to do it in the investment bank, asset management, private banking globally. And we continue to spend quite an amount of money. I think this year's budget is another $40 to $45 million. So you see, we're really trying to get this right.
okay.
And I think one of the things, I mean, we feel the combination of the steps we've taken with the waiver, with the full implementation of the projects that we've laid out with FATCA will allow us to be, 100% compliant with those requirements around U.S. taxpayers. So we feel very good about that. And in fact, we also believe we see some progress in this, because as the exit project has gone on, we have not seen, and we haven't seen from any of our regulators or other investigative bodies, any issues that have come up post-2009. So actually that exit project, we think, has actually worked pretty well. And we believe we are in a position now, which is where we wanted to be, which is so that we can be compliant going forward. And as the chairman said, to make sure that any business we do with any U.S. client is done on a completely compliant basis. That's our objective.
Now, again, you've reported, or we certainly in our reports, we see the size of U.S. banking assets in Credit Suisse. Do you have any estimate of U.S. assets in total housed in Switzerland?
I don't know if we do. I don't think we do have that estimate, no. You're saying U.S. citizen assets
yeah,
in Swiss banks?
Swiss banks.
I do not have that in hand, no. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Johnson.